Hello, everybody. So my name is Stephen Coots. I'm a lecturer in the law school in UCC, and I'm the convener of a John Monaghan module. So it's a module which is co-funded by the European Commission on Brexit and the future of Europe. And this is one of the public talks which is associated with that module. So it's part of a series of talks. We have some more information on the website of the event, and we've had a couple so far, and we will have one final keynote lecture by Bridget Laffin on the 21st of April. I'll post the link to the website in the chat function, and if you're interested, you can go and have a look at it there. The overall series is designed to address Brexit and other challenges facing the European Union, and the changes which are impacting on the European Union at the moment as it kind of faces into its future. We are in a kind of a moment of constitutional change to some extent in the European Union. So, as part of that, we are delighted to have Ken McDonagh from Dublin City University, the School of Law and Government, to speak to us today about the changes or the current state, I suppose, of EU defence policy and security policy, and in particular Ireland's place within that. And the talk will be chaired by a colleague from UCC, Dr Andrew Cottey. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew to introduce Ken, and we can take it from there. I think we're going to have a discussion or presentation by Ken for maybe 20-25 minutes, and then followed by a questions and answer session. So that's from me for the moment, and I'll hand over to Andrew. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Stephen. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce Ken McDonagh. I've known Ken and his work for a good number of years now. Ken is an associate professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, and he's been working on EU foreign security and defence policy for a number of years, and he's published things on various aspects of that, including the Western Balkans, gender issues in relation to the EU's common security and defence policy, and also Irish engagement with the CSDP. Also Ken has an India connection. He's involved in work funded by EU Horizon 2020 on EU-India relations. So I'm very pleased to welcome Ken. Just to say, in terms of questions, if people have questions, you can maybe type them into the chat function, or you can just indicate in the chat function that you'd like to ask a question, or alternatively there's the raise hands function. So we'll sort of deal with the questions, but as I say, I'm very pleased to welcome Ken, who's excellently qualified to tell us about both the current state of EU debates on common security and defence policy, but also Ireland's engagement with that. So thank you, Ken.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and to Stephen as well for inviting me down. When you put this, to me initially, I think we all assumed we would be able to do this in person. Now, I'm hopeful you can all see the screen I'm sharing there. But it turns out we're still in Zoom land at this particular point. I'd also, just as a caveat on the title of the presentation, I'm always worried about giving titles with the future of anything in the title. I mean, there's an old joke that economic forecasting was invented to make horoscopes look good, and IR forecasting was invented to make economic forecasting look good. So I'm not going to, claim to have a huge amount of insight into where these changes are going. But what I want to do is sort of address two questions through the presentation. One is to look at what challenges Brexit poses to the EU security and defence structure and the EU's sense of identity as a global actor, as for those of you engaged with the readings I suggested to Stephen would know about. And then to look at how that challenges Ireland's traditional policy of military non-alignment. In order to address that, I'll start by looking at the EU as a security actor and look specifically at some of the recent institutional innovations, particularly Pesco, that have proven somewhat controversial in Ireland's political structures, and then give a brief overview and introduction of Ireland as a neutral but engaged country, and look in a little bit of detail at the debate around whether or not Ireland should become engaged in the Pesco structures, as that might give us some insight as to the direction of travel when it comes to Ireland's role in this particular area. And then we'll try and draw some tentative conclusions about as I said, those implications for Brexit, both for the EU and for Irish defence policy. So thinking about the EU as a security actor is something I think that's relatively recent when we're thinking about European integration. Albeit, if we go back to the beginning, there was some discussion about a separate European defence community, which ultimately foundered and didn't go anywhere. And the question of European security and defence was largely pushed out towards NATO. And therefore, in the Cold War, the EU was primarily focused, or the EEC as it was then, on economic integration and political cooperation, although there is a sort of a prehistory of coordinating the foreign policy of European member states. But the classic framing of the debate was between Claude Duchen's idea of a civilian power Europe, with the EU representing a different kind of actor in global affairs, and Hedley Bull's sort of dismissal of the European community as an international actor of any real import, largely because he argued that it didn't have military capabilities. After the Cold War, there was sort of a revisiting of this question within the EU. What we see in the institutional evolution of Europe in the 1990s and into the 2000s is the emergence of common foreign and security policy as a third pillar, or as a second pillar in the European treaty framework, and then brought in as a main area of concern under Lisbon. And alongside that, I suppose, various initiatives and attempts to make those aspirations real. So we've had the creation of battle groups, the deployment of missions across the Western Balkans into sub-Saharan Africa, as far afield as Indonesia, the establishment of the EAS, the promotion of the role of High Representative as a vice president of the Commission, the development of strategy documents beginning in 2003, updated in 2008, and replaced with the EU Global Strategy in 2016. And all of that sparked a sort of a large academic debate about what does this actorness mean? And that tended to be framed in terms of either dismissing the EU's effectiveness because of a relative lack of capabilities, or concerns that those capabilities that were being developed were somehow transforming the normative or traditional focus of the EU as an actor interested in rule of law, in cooperation, and multilateralism. That kind of brings us up to 2016 and Brexit. What was happening now? It's interesting to note that the EU Global Strategy that was launched in 2016, that was scheduled to happen late in 2016, regardless of Brexit, and it really was kind of a marker of intent, or of I suppose a statement of determination on the part of the EU that was still pushed forward in the aftermath of the Brexit vote. And what that might lead us to expect in that context is that we'll see in the EU a growing coherence around common foreign and security policy priorities, because Britain was, with the exception of a brief period under Tony Blair, less than enthusiastic about the development of independent EU capabilities. But also as the three main effects of Britain leaving, which is it greatly reduces EU capability. Britain is one of the most militarily capable states when it was a member, really only comparable to France, and in some ways more capable than France. A trade-off for that might be more cohesion, in that you no longer have three large member states with very large differences about their views of what the EU security actor should be. And now you only really have two large member states in Germany and France, who tend to be more closely aligned, albeit not entirely on the same page. And as a product for that, and this is where we can shift the focus to Ireland in a little bit, less space for those awkward states to avoid the spotlight. So countries like Ireland, some of the other neutral states, countries like Denmark who've opted out of CSDP, focusing instead on NATO as their main area of multilateral security cooperation. So the effect of Britain and Brexit leaving, or Britain leaving the EU, is pulling in a number of different directions. It's reducing capability, perhaps creating more cohesion, but also perhaps putting more of a spotlight on certain states within the European Union. What's happened in practical terms is I think, equally interesting. And again, I just want to bring a sort of focus down to the bottom of the slide there. So as I said, we had the development of the second pillar through treaty reform in the 1990s and into the 2000s, with CSDP emerging post-Lisbon. And what we saw through that period was an increased focus within the EU on developing distinct European capabilities. And what we mean by that, I'll touch on in the next slide when we look at these structures in a little bit more detail. But it began with a focus on interoperability, what's known as the battle group concept in developing rapid reaction forces. The aspiration post-San Malo was that the EU would have sort of 60,000 deployable troops ready to respond in a relatively short period. We've never quite gotten there, but the battle groups have been stood up for almost 2 decades at this point. And the orientation, or the belief, was that these would be used in pursuit of what are known as the Petersburg tasks, largely around humanitarian intervention, around civilian protection, the kinds of roles and capabilities that Ireland has done quite a lot of in terms of its UN involvement. In terms of making this real within the European institutions over the last 20 years, we've seen some significant developments. The European Defence Agency was established in 2004, albeit it wasn't placed on a treaty footing until the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. And then post the European Global Strategy, we've seen a number of initiatives around Permanent Enhanced Structured Cooperation, or Pesco as it's also known, the Coordinated Annual Review of Defence, and the creation of the European Defence Fund, and just agreed in the last week or so, the European Peace Facility, which again is mobilising European financial resources for the first time towards the development of military capabilities, both within the European Union and in support of states that the EU works in partnership internationally. Just to give you an overview of how some of these things link together and what the end goal is, I'm just going to touch on this slide from the European Defence Agency, and it sort of describes the step process that's involved in working from your common priority setting through the card system into Pesco, and ultimately the effect on capabilities. The key message here, in terms of member state, a member state perspective, and the Irish perspective perhaps particularly, is if we look at the end, the capabilities that are produced through the system remain owned by member states. But what they do is they produce a kind of coherent set of usable, deployable, interoperable, sustainable capabilities and forces across Europe that can fit together if a member state chooses to become involved in it. And if you step back and look at Pesco, the way it's structured is somewhat similar. It's an opt-in system. It creates a forum for potential cooperation and enhanced cooperation among voluntary groups of member states addressing specific capability needs, which have been identified through the card system, and prior to that through the capability development plan. So what we see here is the EU taking a coordinating and facilitating role for member states to try to achieve their own priorities within a European context, but to steer that in a direction so that the net effect is reduced duplication across European militaries, and a more capable common European capability at the end point. And through the EDF in particular, the European Union is able to put some supports financially towards those kinds of developments. What's slightly less comfortable from this perspective, and we'll come back to when we go to the Pesco debates in the Irish Parliament, is these are structural, these are long-term engagements among the member states, touching directly on questions of military security and defence, and therefore they're not as flexible or adaptive as perhaps something like engagement in a CSDP mission is, for example. So it's not a one-off thing. It's something that involves cooperation over a number of years towards an end that makes cooperation much more viable in the future. So there is a direction of travel, built into the system. In a sense, what we're almost seeing is a kind of a defense version of the functionalism that's worked so well in European economies, where we see that merging of supply chains, that socialization of cooperation and coordination, and that's seeping over into defense capabilities. So what we've seen in the EU in that very brief overview, and I'm happy to go into it in questions as well, is a greater focus on enabling the development of capabilities, a greater focus on articulating a view of what the EU's role is globally, and articulating it at an EU level. And then in the context of Brexit, we're seeing an EU that is perhaps capable of becoming more cohesive, although that's not necessarily a linear path, as we're seeing with some tensions in relation to the EU's relations with China, the EU's relations with Russia, with different member states adopting quite different attitudes to what kind of angle or what kind of strategic orientation the EU should have in those contexts. How does this relate to Ireland? What specific challenges does it present? Well, I'm sure as most of you are familiar, because we bang on about it a little bit, Ireland is a militarily neutral country. It has been, arguably throughout its independence, although really the policy of neutrality is only articulated clearly in the context of the Second World War, and to some extent our engagement with the League of Nations prior to that would suggest we were at the very least open to the idea of collective security in support of international law. The academic debates on Irish neutrality produce a variety of different explanations for where this comes from and what it means. My colleague Karen Devine argues strongly that it's a continuation of a historical tradition that she traces right back to the earliest parts of an Irish independence and Republican movement. For Bill McSweeney, he argues that primarily our articulation of neutrality was about differentiation. It was about sort of marking out our independence from the United Kingdom and separating out a distinct path. And if he's right, there's some obviously very interesting implications for that and our understanding of attitudes towards European security cooperation post-Brexit. For Ben Tonra, his argument is that it's a more pragmatic approach that's always been quite flexible in its implementation, and there's good evidence of that looking at our actual behaviour in the Second World War, where neutrality was in place in principle, but in practice our treatment of the different sides of that conflict suggested that our neutrality certainly had a strong preference for one side over the other. And sort of taking that further, Trevor Salmon has argued that it's primarily an opportunistic stance that's indefensible and relies on the free riding of security provided by others. So there's a huge amount of heat in that debate in the academic literature. But really the nub for this talk is that they all tend to agree that there tends to be a gap between what the general public understand neutrality to be and what our actual policies are. And really where they differ is the extent to which that gap presents a unique or distinct problem in the context of Irish foreign and security policy. In practical terms, this question of neutrality has raised its head in the context of European integration. We joined in 1973, albeit with we joined in 1973, albeit with the opposition of the Labour Party at the time, but strong support from both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and post joining our parties of government at least have been strongly supportive of deeper integration, and that is sort of transferred through to our engagement with the development of CSFP and CSTP post 2009. We've been one of the most active participants in CSTP missions. We've been engaged in battle group formations as well, with under the Nordic battle group and a German-led battle group as well. But there's always been something of a tension between, I suppose, that policy level engagement with this integration and both popular understanding and popular support for that. So we find if we go back and look at both the Nice and the Lisbon treaties, which were rejected on the first vote, in both cases, concerns around militarisation of the European Union were certainly mobilised as part of the campaign, and they were reported back by no voters as a significant part of the reasons why they opposed those particular treaty innovations. And that's reflected in both the addition of the Seville Declaration to the Nice Treaty and amendments to the Lisbon Treaty text around common security and defence, which reflects national characteristics that at an elite level as well. Ireland has always recognised there was a needle to thread here between our commitment to European integration and the degree to which popular opinion and public support would transfer and continue to accept that. So there's always been this tension between what we've tried to do in practice and what we've been willing to sort of declare about our defence and security orientation. And that brings us to Pesco, because I think it's an interesting one. The slide calls it a perfect storm, which is maybe overstating it, but it's an interesting case where we might expect some of these tensions to bubble through to the surface in the context of the Dáil debate and vote around engagement with Pesco itself. So we've seen over the last 3 election cycles in Ireland is a fairly transformative process that has changed the shape of the Irish party system. The main traditional parties, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Labour, Ireland is traditionally characterised as a sort of a 2.5 party system, have been greatly reduced, both in terms of the seat numbers that they hold and their overall vote. And we've seen a rise in new parties, particularly parties which have at various times been viewed as anti-system or anti-establishment, whether that's the sort of Solidarity, PBPA, AAA, sort of radical left-wing parties, or Sinn Fein for a variety of different reasons, which have been viewed as being anti the Irish state as much as they are anti the British state, and the rise of left independence and one or two right independents or right small parties as well, in the context of, say, Matty McGrath or Aintu. So when Pesco was brought to the Parliament, it was in a somewhat unique situation in that we had a minority government that was Fine Gael supported by independents. 2 of those independents had campaigned as part of the Peace and Neutrality Alliance against both the Lisbon and the Nice Treaty. And so we had a potential here for kind of a first major disruption of Ireland's engagement in this particular initiative. So what I want to just look at very briefly now is just some of the highlights of the Dáil debate on the Pesco motion before getting to the results and the pattern of the results, and then I'll come back to what this might mean for the future both of European security cooperation and Ireland's engagement in that security cooperation as well. So the government position is fairly straightforward, and this is taken from Simon Coveney's speech on the topic, that the wider context is the EU is facing new and ever more complex challenges. In other words, security has changed. It's not just about an enemy out there. There are a variety of different ways in which we need to react to security differences. Ireland, as he states, has always strongly supported the development of CSDP and an EU capacity to respond in support of the UN. So he's referencing the sort of the triple lock that Ireland has on the actual engagement in security and defence missions. And at Ireland's insistence, so he's sort of claiming the credit that Pesco's participation expressly stipulated it will be undertaken in full compliance with the Treaty and European Union and associated protocols, so there are no implications for Ireland's policy of military neutrality. We find in support of that, Fianna Fáil speak quite strongly, and this is interesting. This is in a Fianna Fáil were in a confidence and supply arrangement, essentially, in facilitating the minority government for this period, and they didn't take Pesco as an opportunity to sort of win a battle against the government, which suggests quite sincere beliefs about the positive outcomes of engaging that. So it's not about creating a European army or undermining neutrality. and not joining would show we're less committed to working with other member states. So it's framed in this sort of dual way of being, it isn't a threat to our traditional military orientation or strategic orientation, but it is quite important in signalling to our European partners that, this is, we're still a good member state and a positive contributor to the European project. They do tie it, though, to questions around increase in defence spending, and point out that, well, the defence budget is already too small, and any concerns about increasing defence spending really aren't merited given the very small numbers that we actually spend. On the opposition side, we have Sinn Fein, who were deeply critical of both the way in which the Pesco motion was put forward. It was only forced to a debate by the coordination of the opposition parties. The government wanted to push it through without a debate, and they expressed it in terms of concern about elites pulling the wool over the eyes of the Irish electorate, becoming dependent on an EU military programme that won't be under control, and a deeper integration in the Union's military system, completely unacceptable. So Sinn Féin are putting this down as almost an existential threat to Ireland's traditional security policy. And this is quite significant because if we think of where the direction of travel is in terms of party support, Sinn Féin are likely to find themselves in government at some point over the next couple of election cycles. Labour and the Green Party, who have a more mixed record in terms of their support or opposition to European security and defence initiatives, largely linked to their presence or absence on government benches. Both opposed Pesco in this context. For Labour Party, it was about militarisation. For the Green Party, they call out the potential links to NATO and concerns around comments made by then President Jean-Claude Juncker, the then head of the European Commission, who was talking about a need to develop a European defence union, and how that will be both in NATO's interest and the interest of a more militarised view of Europe than the Green Party was comfortable with. Albeit, should we mention, there are Green parties across Europe in governments that are members of countries that are members of NATO states. And you get a sort of a recapitulation of that when you look at the other left-wing parties in the Dáil at the time about, again, the government is pulling a fast one, that they've gambled that we're all thinking about Brexit and the media will ignore this legislation. Some contrast drawn between Fine Gael, who are seen as being a little bit more open about their desire to be part of a common European security and defence, and Fianna Fáil, who are trying to have it both ways. The mention of Shannon Airport, and the last intervention about that this isn't based on threats to Ireland, that we're neutral and we're separate and we're able to opt out from these security questions. And last but not least, we've Matty McGrath, who might be described as a socially conservative independent. And again, it raises this issue of accountability, of transparency, and engagement. And as he puts it himself, he felt this started, back with the treaty debates and the Lisbon Treaty. And I put my hand up and say that, like in Egypt, I voted for the treaty, but he didn't campaign the second time. So it's sort of, again, feeding into this narrative of a separation between elites and the general population. As it turns out, to get to the punchline on Pesco, the motion was passed, 75 votes to 42, so with the support of Fianna Fáil and several of the independents involved in government, and a sort of a blanket no vote from the other members of the Dáil who were present at the time. We initially engaged in two projects, one related to a military training centre, and the other in relation to satellite technology. We've ended our participation in the military training centre as of March 2020, so we're currently engaged in only one project under Pesco, and we've declined to sign up to any further projects in the two subsequent rounds of Pesco initiatives. And that maybe captures the hesitancy on the part of the government we seem to be pushing forward with these projects, given the kinds of opposition that they're facing within Dáil Éireann and potentially at the ballot box outside of that. So, to draw some tentative conclusions and leave 20 minutes for questions. At an EU level, the impact in Brexit has been somewhat counterintuitive. So yes, there's the issue of capabilities and the loss of capabilities, not just in terms of former military strength that the UK brought, but also in relation to intelligence, in relation to other forms of cooperation and diplomatic clout. But sort of paradoxically, we've probably seen more innovation and development in the area of European security cooperation over the last 5 years than we saw in the 20 or 30 or even 40 years prior to that. That presents challenges, though, because for some member states who've managed to glide through without too much scrutiny of their independent positions, because of the gaps that did exist between the UK, France and Germany, that dynamic is less unpredictable, and there's less space or less shadow for states like us to use or to operate within. So on an Irish level, there are some interesting implications. There are, I think, and you can see it in the Pesco debates and some subsequent debates in Dáil Éireann as well, there are gaps between elite and public understandings of neutrality, and a tendency on the part of governments to try and avoid discussion where possible. So, the debate on Pesco wasn't initially scheduled until the opposition, kicked up a fuss and forced it onto the agenda. There have been some improvements in engagement, and the Commission on the Defence Forces is one example of that. The recent National Security Summit is another, though not organised by the state. But we need to be very careful of this, because there is the potential for neutrality to become part of a populist critique that can use this sort of silence or unwillingness to address seriously security and defence issues and exploit those towards an end. And that's with neutrality being so closely bound to our national identity. It really does deserve to be debated openly and democratically, which is hopefully what we're going to do in the remaining 20 minutes of this session. So I think if I go here, no. I just need to, there we go. I have now stopped sharing, I believe.
Yep, that's correct. So, I mean, Ken, that was great, and thanks very much. And you've covered an awful lot there. So, just to say to people, if you want to ask questions, you can type them into the chat, or you can just put, I have a question into the chat, or you can raise your hand as well. So, I mean, I have one or two questions that I might put to Ken as well, but I'd rather give other people the opportunity first. So would anyone like to ask a question or make a comment? Okay, I see we have a question from Dermot, please. You want to maybe unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Hi.
Yep.
Yeah, just wanted to point out on the Pesco vote as well, there's actually two members of the government, McGrath and John Hyden, that skipped the vote. So that was an interesting one. They skipped over. And the other one, I guess, is about like the peacekeeping and kind of missions that we're involved in at the moment, in particular like Mali. There's recently a whole lot of discussion after make the decision to
sorry to cut across you, Dermot, but the sound quality is very poor. I don't know if you want to make it any better, or alternatively whether you want to maybe type a question into the chat, maybe.
Okay.
While Dermot is typing, I did catch her that the first part of the question was just the two independent members of government who were members of PANA managed to absent themselves from the Oireachtas on the day the vote on Pesco took place, which is perhaps a way of avoiding directly working against your own interests.
Okay, I think we have one question from Sam in the chat. I'll just read it out. Ken can probably see it as well.
Yep.
What is the impact of the disengagement of the US as a military power?
Well, I think the jury is out whether we can go as far as saying it's disengagement. But there has been a consistent message, particularly post-Cold War, that the US wants the European Union and Europe more generally to stand more on its own 2 feet in the context of security and defence, both in terms of defence spending, capabilities, and so on. And I think, in addition to Brexit in 2016, we had another significant electoral event, which was the thankfully one-term President Donald Trump came into office. And he repeated what several US presidents prior to that had said about European security and defence, but in his own inimitable way, obviously got more attention on that and managed to mischaracterise the way NATO is funded. But I do think there's an influence there that Europe is slowly coming to realise that it can no longer rely on US defence capabilities, or at least rely on defence capabilities from the US without there being some transactional cost involved. And there's a significant part of the EU level debate, which is about, one of the reasons we want to have our own capabilities is that we don't want to be dragged in or sort of subordinate to US decision making when it comes to geopolitics. So I think there's more recognition now than there was perhaps pre 2016 that this is a real issue that needs to be addressed. But again, I think the US would be quite happy to remain engaged as much as it can, because I think it prefers close collaboration rather than a fully autonomous Europe.
And I don't know if you see also
Yep.
Thanks, Ken, in the chat there's a question from Paul Conway, which is PESCO part of the terms of reference for the Commission on the Defence Forces, and what are or might be the implications of PESCO, etc., for this review? And maybe just before Ken answers that, I'm going to put on a hat of my own. I'm currently chair of the Royal Irish Academy's Standing Committee on International Affairs, and in fact on next Wednesday, so a week today, there will be an online seminar run by the Royal Irish Academy on this commission on the Defence Forces, and if anyone is interested in listening into that seminar, they're very welcome to do so. And in fact, Ken will be chairing one of the sessions at that seminar as well. So apologies for that little bit of advertisement for that separate event. Ken, do you want to come back to the question, maybe?
I do. We didn't give me quite long enough to Google the terms of reference for the Commission on the review of the Defence Forces. But I don't believe PESCO is explicitly called out there. I mean, they are looking at capabilities and planning. And I think I would be hopeful that they would view PESCO as an opportunity to address some of the capabilities issues within the Irish Defence Forces. We kind of have two problems in the Irish Defence Forces at the moment. One is the retention problem. We see that in the Naval Service particularly pronounced at the moment, but in the Army and the Air Force as well. And that's something that needs to be addressed both in terms of remuneration and sort of career pathways for members of the Defence Forces, and perhaps looking at the reserve and using them more effectively as well. But PESCO does provide opportunities for us to address, what kind of systems we want in the context of the Defence Forces. There is a European patrol corvette, which could fit some Irish needs in the maritime space. I know there are concerns that the helicopter fleet currently operated by the Air Corps is coming to its end of life, particularly given the way they're being used for a number of things that those helicopters weren't particularly designed for, specifically firefighting capabilities. And again, it's something that, in the context of PESCO, we can identify these as capabilities we need to address and look for ways to, cooperate with other European countries with similar concerns and reduce costs as a result. And then there has been some debate around whether a fast fighter jet response capability is required in an Irish context, given the tendency of certain states to use our airspace as a backdoor to elsewhere. I'm personally unconvinced that we could have or develop a significant capability in that space. But again, it's the kind of area that we could look at, and PESCO could be a useful forum in which to pursue that kind of procurement and engagement. I see Dermot has made it back on for the
Yeah, so again, if people can't see, I might read out. So Dermot, thanks for typing in your question. So Dermot says, is Irish civil society well equipped to monitor the additional overseas missions envisaged for the Defence Forces through EU military operations? I'm thinking in particular about Mali and how little coverage that conflict receives here. So.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the EU in Mali, there's a training mission that is deployed, and in the context of the coup that took place in Mali, that was suspended. I haven't gone back to look at what the latest status of the training mission is. We've also had forces deployed as part of the UN mission in Mali, though I believe that deployment may have already come to an end, and I'm not sure we renewed for further part of that. But I'd agree with you. I mean, it's an area that doesn't get a huge amount of coverage, neither from the from the press or from parliamentary oversight. So I think there's a greater role for the Oireachtas if it's serious about influencing security and defence policy, to spend time looking at these. I mean, we do have a formal deployment vote. When we do send more than 12 troops on a military mission, more than 20 on a training mission. So there is definitely scope to develop more oversight there. We could consider, as they do with other countries, where there are almost sunset clauses on deployment votes, so that a mandate has to be renewed by the Parliament, rather than just having a sort of one-off vote. And then they're there for what can be quite sustained periods of time. So I think there are definite improvements that can be made in terms of oversight, and in terms of both media and civil society coverage.
Thanks, Ken. And then there's another question from Sam. So Sam says, what will be Ireland's position role as different European powers stand on different sides of geopolitical balances and conflicts? For example, France versus Germany in the tension between Greece and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean, and France versus Italy in the Libyan conflict. So a nice easy one there, Ken.
Yeah, that's kind of handy. I mean, we try not to take sides. That's sort of our position, and support international law. So we kind of look at what are the legal issues at stake, what are the principles at stake, and we tend to be reasonably consistent in that. I mean, in terms of France versus Germany, and which tensions between Greece and Turkey, that's sort of an ongoing issue that is decades old. So I think Ireland has a difficult path to walk in relation to geopolitical tensions. The policies that we've had in the past, where we've taken a sort of non-aligned stance, hasn't been consistently deployed. So if you look at, say, our voting pattern in the UN General Assembly, we're fairly well defined as a member of the Western Bloc across a whole range of different issues. When it comes to something where it involves two EU member states having very different positions, that's where we would probably try and keep the head down, unless there's something that is directly at stake in terms of our own interests, our own principles. So our position is on a case by case basis, and is rooted in a principled commitment to international law, a desire to avoid appearing partisan when there's open conflicts at stake. But there's also a difficulty in maintaining or threading that needle when we move into a more multipolar world, and it isn't a case of two fairly clear sides, one of which we have very close alignment to and one of which we don't, to one where you may have multiple different sides of varying degrees of distance from our own preferred position. And when we're a small open economy that relies on trade both within the EU and outside the EU, we need to try and balance those interests.
Thanks, Ken. I might kind of take chair's privilege to ask you one about Brexit, or maybe to say a bit more about it. One of the broader things about Brexit has been the degree to which the other EU member states have shown solidarity with Ireland, and that's been really, certainly to me, but I think to many other observers, very, very striking. And I wonder, do you think that at some point, and possibly on the defence issue, there may be a kind of expectation of payback almost, or that other EU member states may come to a future Irish government and say, look, we've supported you very strongly over Northern Ireland and the protocol and so on. We want or expect you to support us on defence. I mean, is there a kind of potential sort of dilemma or challenge there in future?
I can't see it ever being a straight quid pro quo, partly because there is still enough diversity of opinion around defence within the EU for Ireland to find a working coalition that it can engage with. And it has committed to not be obstructionist in terms of other states who want to move forward with closer defence cooperation. So, Pesco is a good example of that, where we haven't been enthusiastic participants, but we also haven't been a block on others engaging in that area. Where I might expect something like that is in discussion of tax harmonisation, or areas where there's a more consistent view in the bloc, or a larger group of states who have a common view. And Ireland is very much an outlier now, particularly post Brexit. And I think that's an area where we probably need to be mindful of any trade-offs we'd be asked to make. And we also see that the flip side of that, because while there has been a huge amount of solidarity to Ireland in the Brexit process, there is a degree of growing weariness around member states for whom Brexit is not a major existential issue, and a concern that Ireland is in some ways being used by the UK as a leverage to get more of what it wants in other aspects of its relationship with the European Union. So I think we need to, again, the joy of being a small country, we need to walk this kind of fine line where we have interest around the Northern Ireland Protocol, we have interest about our long-established relationship with the UK, and we also have interest with our relationship with the EU, and we need to avoid being seen by our EU partners, who we're still a fundamental part and core part of that organisation, as somehow being an advocate for the British position. And we saw, I think it's in that context we can read, for example, the UK's offer of slightly fictional vaccines, again as a way of sort of pulling Ireland closer to London's position, rather than working more in solidarity with the European partners.
Thanks, Ken. We've probably we're coming towards the end, but we've time probably for one or two more questions. So if anyone else has a question, please feel free to put it in the chat, or to raise your hand in the raise hand function. Yeah, Stephen, do you want to come in with a question, please?
Yeah, sorry. I mean, if nobody else has any question, and just hopefully this is a short enough one, I'm not sure, but it's also following on from the Brexit comment. Is there any plans for, or scheme or framework for future cooperation between the UK and the EU in the defence area? Like, does the future relationship address this? I mean, and it's just something I'd be interested in.
So in the context of Pesco, they're entitled to become part as a third country, which leaves them outside the sort of the framing of priorities and the planning of those areas. Similarly in CSDP, it's a third country partnership. So what you really have is the French initiative, the European Intervention Initiative, which is outside of EU structures, which is seen as a coordinating forum, particularly for the UK and France, and a number of other willing member states. There's a great overlapping Venn diagram of all these different organisations to keep them in, to keep them in order. But certainly in terms of the policy direction, strategic priorities, and capabilities development, they're outside. That said, there's obviously also that significant overlap with NATO, and European NATO member, EU NATO member states. There's always going to be a close degree of coordination through that NATO context. With what is happening at the EU level. And one of the more interesting dynamics I'd like to keep an eye on in that context is the extent to which the EU becomes a driver of those capability developments within NATO as well. So you have the European Union, NATO states cooperating in an EU formation, then moving to discuss things in a NATO context, and they're obviously going to bring in, pre-existing positions to that, at which the UK finds itself as one or two parties at a table against a bloc, rather than as being at the very core of driving that, which is where it has been in the past.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ken. I might just kind of use Chair's privilege again to ask you perhaps one last question we just squeeze in, and I know it's something that you've worked on in the parliamentary context, but I suppose it's the kind of comparative bit. So the debate in Ireland, does that debate look very similar to or very different to debates in other countries? There's kind of a tendency here to say, oh, Ireland is different and distinctive, and we should perhaps be cautious and ask, is that actually the case? Maybe so.
It's different to some countries. I mean, the issue around neutrality, it obviously shares with other neutral states who are also members of the European Union. But in terms of parliamentary oversight, in terms of democratic accountability of foreign policy decision making, we're quite similar. So in that comparative project, we see that national parliaments don't do a great job of holding executives to account when it comes to foreign policy decision making. There tends to be high levels of consensus, so that what I mentioned there about Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael being, broadly on the same page is replicated across much of Europe, with the two sort of centrist main parties having very common foreign policy priorities. So I think there are a lot of parallels there. What's different, I guess, is the specific symbols that are used in Ireland has been significant. So there it's around neutrality and tradition and identity. In other countries, it's about NATO membership or non-NATO membership, or maybe about references to an imperial past, or current commercial and economic interests. They tend to map onto a centre that is broadly supportive of multilateral security cooperation and engagement in external missions, and parties on the right and on the left, which tend to be more critical and sceptical and more isolationist in their foreign policy orientation.
Okay, that's great, Ken. Well, we're almost at 2:00, so I think I'll bring this to an end, and Stephen may want to add something, but just to say thanks very much to Ken. You covered an awful lot, and I think, we've all learned things, and as you've suggested, all of this is part of trying to contribute to maybe a more developed debate on these issues. If we look over the last 10, 15 years, we've had some of that debate, but the issue isn't going to go away. So thanks very much, Ken. That was absolutely great. And Stephen, do you want to say a last couple of words?
Not especially. I was just going to want to echo what you, Andrew, have just said. Thanks very much to Ken for this. I think it was perfect. It kind of hit the brief right in the head. It informed me certainly, and I hope the students a lot. And also hopefully contributed to, as you say, a kind of a more sustained and informed engagement on this issue, because it's just an area which I kind of feel in European integration is advancing forward, and sometimes we don't seem to be having the necessary conversations here. So thank you for that. And I owe you at least a dinner, and hopefully a lot more, and hopefully we'll have you down in person at some point, and be able to thank you in person. So thanks again. Yeah,
I'm just extremely jealous that you get the full range of County Cork from April 12th.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
While I'm still stuck in Dublin.
Wherever you ever leave, that means. Grand. Okay, so thanks very much, Ken, and thanks Andrew as well for sharing. It was really, really nice.
Thanks,
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.